In the final months of the war, while the Allied armies advanced over German territory, hundreds of SS women began abandoning their posts in the concentration camps. Some burned documents, others disposed of their uniforms. Many simply disappeared. They had received training at Ravensbrück, served in Auschwitz, Majdanek or Stutthof, and performed key functions within the system. They were not public figures, nor held high ranks, but their power was absolute within the walls. With the surrender, their names appeared in reports, but their whereabouts remained unanswered. What happened to the female guards after the fall of the Third Reich? How did the Allied forces act to find them? Guardians of the Third Reich, women at the heart of Nazi terror. The incorporation of women into the Nazi repressive apparatus represents one of the least explored chapters of the Third Reich. While history has extensively documented the atrocities committed by male figures such as Heinrich Himmler or Rudolf Höss, approximately 3,500 women played crucial roles in the machinery of terror, particularly in the concentration and extermination camps. This phenomenon challenges the traditional narrative that views systematic violence as exclusively male-dominated. The advertisements published in German newspapers starting in 1939 reflected the deceptive nature of the recruitment. Healthy women between 20 and 40 years are needed for a military base, they promised, offering good wages, food, accommodation, and free clothing. What these offers deliberately hid was that the job involved overseeing concentration camps and that the provided clothing would be an SS uniform. The economic motivation was fundamental in the recruitment process. For many young women from poor families with limited education and few professional opportunities, working in a concentration camp represented a higher salary, comfortable housing, and economic independence. This economic reality was more attractive than factory work available to working-class women, especially in wartime. However, the ideological factor should not be underestimated. Many recruits had been previously indoctrinated in Nazi youth organizations and firmly believed in the regime's racial rhetoric. Ravensbrück was established as a training center for all the female guards of the system of camps. In this exclusive women's prisoner complex, located in northern Germany, future supervisors received an intensive 4-week training combining ideological indoctrination and practical preparation. The program transformed ordinary women into efficient cogs in the extermination system, teaching them to view prisoners as subhuman, implement punishments without hesitation, and maintain absolute control over captive populations. They learned administrative aspects, crowd control, use of weapons, application of corporal punishment, and interrogation techniques, while being instilled with Aryan superiority and the need to purify German society. Once trained, the female guards were distributed throughout the Nazi camp network. Their roles covered a broader spectrum than is often recognized. In addition to overseeing barracks and work areas, they participated in the selections that immediately determined the fate of the newly deported, organized, humiliating body searches, oversaw deliberately insufficient food rations, administered punishments, and managed logistical aspects of industrialized extermination. Within the hierarchical system, the female guards held intermediate positions, subordinate to male commanders, but with absolute authority over the female prisoners. This dynamic created what historians have called microcosms of absolute power, where often young women exercised total control over the life and death of thousands of people. The ability to inflict arbitrary suffering became, for many, an unprecedented form of empowerment, perverse but real. Figures like Maria Mandel exemplify the careers possible within the system. Achieving the rank of SS Oberaufseherin, chief supervisor at Auschwitz, Mandel oversaw the entire female section of Birkenau, implementing collective punishment systems and personally selecting victims for Dr. Josef Mengeler's experiments. Her career advanced precisely because of her efficiency in implementing systematic terror. The case of Irma Gress is particularly emblematic. Recruited at 18, her rise was meteoric, becoming at 20 a supervisor of a sector where she directly controlled 30 Jewish prisoners. Her extreme youth contrasted with the sophistication of her cruelty. She used a riding whip to mutilate the breasts of attractive prisoners, trained dogs specifically to attack inmates, and personally selected victims for the gas. chamber based on arbitrary criteria such as envy of prisoners with particularly beautiful hair. The sadism exhibited by many female guards challenges simplistic categorizations of female behavior. Hildegard Lechert, nicknamed the Tigress, was known for facial transformations during her attacks, as if some demonic force took control of her mind and body, according to testimonies from survivors. Hertha Botha used her imposing height, 1.80-2 meters, to physically intimidate malnourished prisoners, systematically beating them when they collapsed under the weight of impossible burdens. This violence was not incidental but structural to the functioning of the system. The regular rotation of female guards between different camps served to normalize increasing levels of brutality. A female guard could begin her duties at Ravensbrück, performing mainly administrative tasks, then be transferred to Auschwitz, where the industrialization of extermination required higher levels of dehumanization, and finally end up at Bergen-Belsen, managing conditions that practically guaranteed death by starvation and disease. Some recovered performance evaluations revealed promotion criteria specifically based on the willingness to implement extreme punishments without emotional hesitation. Demonstrates appropriate firmness towards subhuman elements, indicated a positive evaluation of Juana Bormann, who was later executed for war crimes. This bureaucratic instrumentalization of female violence represented a perverse innovation of the Nazi system. The collapse of the Third Reich in the final months of 1944 and early 1945 provoked diverse reactions among the female guards. Some, recognizing the imminence of defeat, abandoned their posts in an attempt to blend in with the civilian population. Others, particularly those more ideologically committed, remained in their functions until the last moment, continuing executions even as Allied troops approached. Recovered documentation shows that in Bergen-Belsen, guards continued to administer conditions of deliberate starvation during the week leading up to its liberation, when Germany's defeat was already unquestionable. The fall of the Third Reich, the hunt for the SS guards. The fall of the Third Reich in May 1945 generated a state of widespread chaos. While prominent figures of the regime tried to flee or commit suicide, thousands of lesser collaborators, including the female guards of the camps, faced an uncertain future in a Germany occupied by forces coming to settle accounts for the horrors discovered. The first captures occurred during the liberation of the camps themselves. Bergen-Belsen, liberated by British troops on April 15, 1945, provides a paradigmatic case extensively documented in military reports and historical photographs. The British soldiers of the 11th Armoured Regiment found an apocalyptic scene, approximately 10 decomposing corpses among barracks filled with dying prisoners. The magnitude of the horror triggered visceral reactions among veteran troops. In this context, British forces arrested 47 SS personnel present, including 21 women. Historical photographs show guards like Irma Grez, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Herta Ehlert lined up in formation, maintaining composure while victims of their administration lay around them. Major Norman Wickham documented the initial inability of many of the guards to comprehend the gravity of their situation, describing attitudes ranging from indignation at their arrest to expectations of privileged treatment. Simultaneously, American troops were liberating camps such as Buchenwald and Dachau, while the Red Army had previously discovered Auschwitz and Majdanek. At each location, the pattern repeated itself, guards attempting to blend in with prisoners, quickly discarding uniforms, escape attempts taking advantage of the initial confusion, and violent arrests when survivors identified their torturers. In Stutthof, some guards were lynched by liberated prisoners before Soviet troops could intervene, highlighting the intensity of the accumulated hatred. The systematic identification of fugitive guards presented significant challenges. Unlike high-ranking male officers whose faces were widely recognizable, female guards often lacked public notoriety, making it easier for them to disappear among the displaced population. The Allies gradually implemented complementary methodologies for their location. Survivors played a crucial role by physically pointing out perpetrators or providing detailed descriptions. Particularly valuable were the testimonies of prisoners who had worked in administrative offices with access to records and knowledge of full names. Catherine Niger, a 23-year-old Czech survivor, provided crucial information by identifying Hertha Botha and linking her to multiple murders in Bergen-Belsen. The documentation confiscated from SS offices, although partially destroyed during evacuation, provided invaluable bureaucratic evidence. Payroll records, performance evaluations, and transfer logs between camps allowed for the creation of preliminary lists of sought-after guards. Particularly valuable were Ravensbrück files documenting the initial training of all guards in the system. The denazification programs implemented in occupied areas included mandatory questionnaires, Fragebogen, where residents had to declare previous affiliations. Cross-checking these documents with wanted personnel lists allowed for the identification of cases of deliberate falsification of work backgrounds, leading to additional arrests during the summer and fall of 1945. The conditions of initial detention varied considerably depending on the occupation zone. The first British and American detainees were frequently imprisoned in makeshift facilities, including the same camps where they had served. In Bergen-Belsen, guards like Irma Gräse were initially confined in barracks previously used for SS personnel, creating a reversal of circumstances. Soviet authorities implemented a harsher approach, transferring detainees to interrogation centers in Berlin, Krakow, and Moscow, where Spartan conditions and aggressive techniques produced confessions with questionable evidential value but practical information about the location of other perpetrators. Declassified Soviet documentation decades later revealed that approximately 249 guards were initially detained in the Eastern Zone, with significantly higher mortality rates in custody compared to Western zones. The guards were progressively forced to participate in the cleanup of the camps, directly facing the physical consequences of their administration. Historical photographs show figures like Hertha Botha carrying corpses for mass burial in Bergen-Belsen, work done without gloves under explicit orders from British authorities as a form of confrontation with the tangible results of their criminal negligence. Both would later describe this experience as traumatic, mentioning that her greatest fear was contracting typhus while handling corpses, a concern that Jewish survivors found revealing of continued, morally inverted priorities. The initial interrogations documented consistent defensive patterns among detained guards. Most denied knowledge of mass extermination, described exclusively administrative duties, and claimed to have treated prisoners humanely within limitations imposed by superiors. Confronted with specific testimonies, many resorted to minimization strategies. I was just following orders, or claimed coercion. I would have been sent to a concentration camp if I refused. Irma Gräse constituted a notable exception, maintaining a defiant composure and occasionally expressing continued ideological loyalty to Nazism during interrogations documented by British Major G.A. Smallwood. By the end of 1945, approximately 10 guards were under Allied custody, representing less than 30% of the estimated total. The rest remained fugitives, many already established with forged documents in rural areas of Austria, Bavarian Alpine regions, or areas near the Danish border. The relative ease with which many evaded initial capture raises questions about the real priority assigned to their pursuit compared to male officers. Meanwhile, the occupying forces debated how to prosecute crimes without historical precedents or a pre-existing legal framework. The emerging concept of crimes against humanity required precise legal articulation, while logistical considerations regarding the capacity of the military judicial system posed practical dilemmas. Divergent responses to these issues in different occupation zones would significantly determine the judicial fate of the captured guards. Trials and executions, the condemnation of the Holocaust guards. The trials of camp guards represented an unprecedented chapter in international jurisprudence. While the Nuremberg trials prosecuted the main figures of the regime, specific military tribunals established by occupying powers took on the task of judging thousands of direct perpetrators of atrocities, including women who had served as guards and supervisors. The first significant judicial process against female guards was the Bergen-Belsen trial, which began on September 17, 1945 under British jurisdiction in Lüneburg. Among the 45 accused were 16 women, including Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, Juana Bormann, and Herta Ehlert. The military tribunal, presided over by Major General HPM Bernie Ficklin, set fundamental precedents by legally articulating individual responsibility for mass crimes committed under state authority. The procedural structure combined elements of both Anglo-Saxon and continental legal systems, allowing direct cross-examination, but also admitting sworn statements as evidence. The official charges were deliberately limited to crimes committed against Allied citizens, avoiding legal controversies over jurisdiction for crimes against Germans or stateless persons. The testimonies presented during 54 days of trial revealed a chilling picture of systematized brutality with direct female participation. Anita Lasker, a survivor of Auschwitz and professional cellist, described how Irma Grese personally selected victims for medical experiments based on physical attractiveness. Another witness, Dora Safran, detailed first-hand observation of Grese releasing specially trained dogs against pregnant prisoners, describing her expression as ecstatic during these episodes. The defense of the accused followed predictable patterns, though with significant variations. Irma Grese, represented by Major L.S.W. Cranfield, built her argument on 3 pillars: youth and inexperience, mandatory obedience to superior orders, and factual denial of specific accusations. However, she occasionally deviated from this carefully constructed strategy with spontaneous statements revealing intact ideological convictions, even perplexing her own lawyer. The extensive international press coverage of the trial established enduring cultural archetypes about female perpetrators, particularly crystallized in the figure of Irma Grese. Correspondents expressed bewilderment at the contradiction between her physically attractive appearance and the documented atrocities. Evelyn Waugh, covering the trial for the Daily Telegraph, described the disturbing impact of watching attractive young German women methodically recounting the systematic elimination of children without displaying any emotion. On November 17, 1945, the court announced its verdicts. Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, Juana Bormann, and 8 others were sentenced to death for war crimes. The executions were scheduled for December, allowing for formal appeals, though practically guaranteeing the same outcome. The final days of the condemned were meticulously documented by British military chaplain T.J. Williams. According to his testimony, Irma Grese expressed obsessive concern about her physical appearance during the imminent execution. On the morning of December 13, 1945, Grese was executed by hanging at Hamelin Prison, becoming at 22 years old the youngest war criminal executed under British jurisdiction. Her last documented words were a simple order to the executioner: "Schnell, quickly." Albert Pierrepoint, the British official executioner who personally executed 200 Nazi war criminals, later described in his published memoirs the particular impression left by Grese's behavior in the face of imminent death. "She approached the gallows as if entering an elegant party. I saw no fear, only composure and perhaps contempt." Simultaneously, in Poland, the Auschwitz trial was developing under Soviet Polish jurisdiction. Maria Mandel, who had supervised the female section of Auschwitz-Birkenau, was prosecuted alongside 39 other camp officers. The evidence presented described her central role in the development of the extermination system, including procedural innovations to increase efficiency in the processing of mass transports. Testimonies directly linked her to routine selections and the selection of children specifically for medical experiments supervised by Joseph Mengele. The Supreme National Court of Poland sentenced her to death on December 22, 1947. Her execution by hanging at Montelupich Prison, Kraków, closed the chapter on one of the most lethal perpetrators of the Holocaust. The Stutthof trial, held in Gdansk between April and May 1946, prosecuted another significant group of female guards, including Gerda Steinhoff, Jenny Wanda Bachmann, Elizabeth Becker, Wanda Klaff, and Ewa Paradis. Historical photographs document when the 5 convicted guards were transported for a public execution by hanging on Biskupia Gorka Hill. Approximately 50 Polish citizens witnessed the executions on July 4, 1946. constituting one of the last documented cases of public execution in modern European legal history. Another emblematic case was that of Ilse Koch, the wife of the Buchenwald commander Karl Otto Koch. Although technically not employed as a guard but present as the commander's wife, the Witch of Buchenwald exercised de facto authority over prisoners. Specific charges included personally selecting prisoners with interesting tattoos to be killed, and subsequently ordering the processing of their skin to produce decorative items such as lampshades and book bindings. After an initial trial under American jurisdiction that surprisingly resulted in a reduced sentence later commuted, international protest led to a second prosecution under German authorities in Augsburg, 1951. This court issued a life sentence. Koch remained incarcerated until her suicide in Aichach prison, 1967, maintaining until the end an absolute factual denial of the specific accusations. The specific trials against the female guards revealed recurring defensive patterns that legal historians later systematically categorized. One of these was the argument of structural coercion, in which the accused claimed they had no alternative and were following orders under threat of severe consequences. This argument was systematically rejected when evidence demonstrated that the guards could request transfers without documented reprisals. Another commonly used argument was the denial of knowledge. The accused claimed they were unaware of the final purpose of the concentration camp. However, this argument was invalidated by documentary evidence showing specific training and inevitable physical access to extermination facilities that were visibly evident. Additionally, some defended themselves with selective minimization, arguing they only performed administrative functions and never personally participated in acts of violence. However, this argument was contradicted by cross-examined testimonies from multiple survivors who identified specific perpetrators in direct violent acts. In certain cases, the defendants argued that they accepted the position due to financial difficulties, not ideological conviction. This argument was partially accepted as a mitigating circumstance, especially in cases involving very young defendants without prior history in Nazi organizations. Finally, some attempted to relativize the circumstances by stating that conditions were difficult for everyone, including the staff. This argument was systematically rejected as morally indefensible, given the fundamental disparity between the documented conditions in the camp and those of the staff in charge. Despite these judicial processes, only a fraction of the female guards faced severe legal consequences. Of approximately 3,500 women who served in the camps, fewer than 100 received significant sentences and barely a dozen were executed. The majority were never identified, located, or prosecuted, benefiting from post-war chaos, systematic document destruction, and shifting priorities among the occupying powers. By 1949, Western military courts were progressively reducing their activity, while emerging German authorities began to assume jurisdiction over pending cases. This transition coincided with a fundamental shift in geopolitical priorities, where the containment of Soviet communism displaced the prosecution of Nazis as a Western political imperative. The Great Escape: How SS Female Guards Evaded Justice. While some prominent faces of the female camp staff faced executions or prolonged sentences, the majority of SS female guards managed to evade significant trials. This massive impunity resulted from a combination of factors: deliberate destruction of administrative records by the SS in the final stages of the war, initial disorganization of the occupying forces, and eventually the shift in priorities towards European reconstruction and the emerging Cold War. The chaos following the German surrender created ideal conditions for escape and concealment. With millions of refugees and displaced persons constantly crossing borders, unidentified female guards could easily blend among uprooted masses. For those who had not reached high-profile positions, a simple change of name, location, and basic appearance often sufficed to start a new anonymous life. Hildegard Neumann, a supervisor at Ravensbrück and active participant in selections for medical experiments, exemplifies this dynamic. After deserting her post days before the Soviet liberation, she obtained false documents as Hilda Brunner, initially settling in a rural area near Bavaria. She later married, adopting her husband's surname, worked as a domestic assistant for decades, and was never identified until her natural death in 1979, when relatives accidentally discovered a carefully preserved SS uniform among her belongings. More sophisticated escape routes were available to female guards with the right connections or financial resources. The so-called rat lines constituted clandestine escape networks organized by Nazi sympathizers, elements within the Vatican, sectors of the International Red Cross, and receptive South American governments. Although these routes were primarily established for high-ranking male officers, later documentation confirms significant female participation in these evasion systems. Argentina, during the presidency of Juan Domingo Perón, 1946–1955, represented a privileged destination for these organized escapes. The ideological sympathy of the Peronist regime, combined with strategic interest in acquiring German technical expertise, created extraordinarily favorable conditions for the discreet integration of former Nazis. Pre-existing German communities in regions such as Bariloche and Córdoba facilitated immediate cultural assimilation while offering protection from external exposure. Particularly notorious was the case of Hermine Braunsteiner, a supervisor at Majdanek and Ravensbrück, documented as responsible for extreme brutality. After initial capture in Austria, she served a brief 3-year sentence and was released in 1950. She later emigrated to Canada and ultimately settled in Queens, New York, where she lived as a respectable housewife under the name Hermine Ryan until being discovered by Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal in 1964. The Cold War radically transformed the landscape of post-Nazi transitional justice. Western powers, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, rapidly redirected strategic priorities from prosecuting Nazi criminals to containing global communism. This new geopolitical reality created surprising opportunities for some female guards, especially those with valuable knowledge about Eastern Europe or Soviet-controlled territories. Documents declassified decades later under the US Freedom of Information Act and equivalent German legislation revealed the previously unknown extent of this institutionalized collaboration. Hildegard Lechert was actively recruited by the CIA and the German intelligence service BND after partially serving her initial sentence. Her personal experience in Soviet-controlled territories represented a valuable asset for Western covert operations against the communist bloc. This instrumentalization of Nazi criminals by Western intelligence services was not a marginal phenomenon, but a systematic program. Operation Paperclip, US, and its British equivalents explicitly prioritized the acquisition of technical knowledge and operational capabilities over moral, legal, or ethical considerations. Although these programs are primarily known for recruiting scientists and male officers, later evidence has shown that several women directly linked to the camp system also received government protection. Thea Müller, a logistics administrator at Ravensbrück with extensive knowledge of railway transport in Eastern Europe, worked as an analyst for British intelligence services during the 1950s–1960s, eventually receiving British citizenship through a discreet, expedited process. Her previous involvement in documented crimes was deliberately overlooked when Yugoslav authorities formally requested her extradition in 1951. Internal documents reveal an explicit instruction to prioritize current operational value over historical behavior. West German authorities, primarily focused on national reconstruction and integration into the Western anti-communist bloc, showed little institutional enthusiasm for pursuing cases that would inevitably reopen recent social wounds. The Basic Law of 1949 and subsequent legislation established statutes of limitations for various crimes, creating windows of opportunity for perpetrators who had remained hidden during the immediate post-war years. Impunity manifested even in cases where perpetrators were initially identified and prosecuted. Herta Botha, known as the sadist of Stutthof for systematically beating female prisoners with sticks until they lost consciousness, was originally sentenced to 10 years in prison but was released under a British amnesty after serving only 5. In an interview decades later, her response when asked directly about remorse revealed persistent moral denial. Remorse? For what? I'm not sure what to say. Did I make a mistake? No, the mistake was the concentration camp itself, but I had to go there. Otherwise, they would have put me in it. That was my mistake. This statement encapsulates the retrospective justification adopted by many female guards who evaded justice. A narrative transformation in which perpetrators reposition themselves as circumstantial victims of a system that supposedly left no viable moral alternatives. The exceptional case of Johanna Langerfeld illustrates additional dimensions of this complex dynamic of evasion. As chief supervisor at Ravensbrück with extensive administrative authority, Langerfeld represented an ideal candidate for severe prosecution. However, later documentation revealed that surviving Polish prisoners actively facilitated her escape from custody in 1946, based on her occasionally more humane conduct, including documented interventions against scheduled executions. This moral ambiguity complicates simplified narratives of guilt. This pattern of massive judicial evasion allowed the majority of the approximately 3,500 women who served as guards to never face legal consequences for their involvement in crimes against humanity. The combination of selective government protection, geopolitical opportunism, administrative negligence, and the simple passage of time ensured that justice, when it eventually arrived, was inevitably partial and delayed. By 1950, when European reconstruction and Cold War tensions completely dominated the international agenda, most fugitive guards had established new identities sufficiently consolidated to consider the immediate danger overcome. However, as the reopening of cases in subsequent decades would demonstrate, this sense of security would prove illusory for some, as organizations dedicated to locating Nazi criminals and new generations of prosecutors would reopen seemingly closed investigations. Under the mantle of silence, the reintegration of SS guards into society. The period between 1950 and 1980 represents the silent reintegration phase for hundreds of former SS guards who had evaded initial capture or served brief sentences before being released through selective amnesties. While Western Europe experienced the post-war economic miracle and Cold War tensions redefined global geopolitical priorities, these women quietly reintegrated into German society as seemingly ordinary citizens, systematically hiding their past. For those who had served reduced sentences, their release in the early 1950s coincided with an extraordinarily opportune moment for complete personal reinvention. Amnesty programs implemented by occupying powers, particularly the British and Americans, were fundamentally driven by practical political considerations rather than abstract principles of justice. The need to stabilize Western Germany as an anti-communist bastion clearly outweighed the imperative to thoroughly pursue perpetrators considered minor within the Nazi hierarchy. The case of Charlotte S. illustrates this recurring pattern documented later by historians. After serving as a guard at Ravensbrück for 2 years, where survivors identified her as actively participating in selections and systematic corporal punishments, she was sentenced to 6 years in prison, but was released in 1951 under a British general amnesty related to the transfer of jurisdiction to German authorities. Receiving entirely new documentation, she returned to her native Bavaria, married and adopted her husband's surname, and worked as a shop assistant at a local bakery until her retirement in 1978. Her neighbors, co-workers, and even her own children never knew of her direct participation in the camp system, only discovering the truth after her death when they found meticulously preserved hidden documentation along with uniformed photographs. The labor reintegration of former guards followed recognizable patterns dictated by the need to maintain an absolutely minimized public profile. The vast majority actively sought positions characterized by relative social invisibility. Factory workers on production lines, domestic assistants in private homes, retail sales assistants, administrative secretaries in small businesses, or cleaning staff in public institutions. They systematically avoided professions with significant public scrutiny, rigorous background checks, or potential media visibility. Many quickly married, adopting new surnames that made it difficult to trace them through existing personnel records of the camps. Rural communities and small provincial towns, far from major urban centers, provided ideal environments for the anonymity they sought. In contrast to metropolitan areas where concentrations of Holocaust survivors could potentially recognize them by accident, smaller towns allowed them to settle with completely fabricated personal histories that were rarely questioned by the receiving communities. Post-war German society, facing its own collective guilt, developed a culture of tacit silence regarding the recent past, creating extraordinarily favorable conditions for these individual biographical reinventions. In West Germany, reintegration was facilitated through government policies explicitly designed for this purpose. The Denazification Completion Law, Gesetz zum Abschluss der Entnazifizierung, enacted in 1951, essentially closed investigations into minor offenders, a category under which virtually all surviving former guards were administratively classified, regardless of specific evidence available. This deliberate political decision reflected the growing consensus between the German administration and the Western occupying powers to prioritize immediate socio-political stability over the exhaustive pursuit of historical accountability. A particularly controversial aspect discovered later was the administrative treatment of service in the camps within the German federal pension system. Retrieved documentation demonstrates that time worked as a guard was frequently recognized as legitimate work experience for retirement calculations, allowing perpetrators to eventually receive state benefits based precisely on the period of involvement in crimes against humanity. This bureaucratic normalization of camp service as regular employment completed an extraordinary cycle in which an initially criminal system was retrospectively legitimized through seemingly neutral administrative procedures. Silence constituted the ultimate strategy of social survival for these women. Former guards rarely discussed their past, even among themselves, maintaining strict informational compartmentalization, even during documented casual meetings. Later testimonies from family members reveal consistent response patterns when questions about the 1939–1945 period occasionally arose. Categorical denial when directly confronted, systematic minimization of their role by presenting themselves exclusively as administrative, with no contact with prisoners, or justification through arguments of economic pressure and obedience to inevitable orders. Psychological compartmentalization allowed for the maintenance of public identities entirely dissociated from actions during the Nazi regime, facilitating an apparently normal social functioning. Some developed elaborate alternative narratives about their past. This narrative of personal victimization was adapted and perfected by many survivors of the camp system who evaded legal consequences. They invariably presented themselves as young and naive women, forced by desperate economic circumstances or family pressures, completely unaware of the greater atrocities supposedly occurring without their knowledge. The absence of significant legal proceedings during this period perpetuated this systematic impunity. Between 1950 and 1963, active investigations into Nazi crimes in West Germany dramatically declined, with minimal resources allocated specifically for locating fugitive guards. The statute of limitations for certain crimes threatened to permanently close the possibility of justice. Until later, legislative reforms established formal imprescriptibility for crimes against humanity. The surviving Jewish communities, traumatized and primarily focused on immediate existential reconstruction after the genocide, initially lacked the organizational resources needed to systematically pursue specific perpetrators. This situation would fundamentally change in the following decades with the establishment of dedicated organizations like the Simon Wiesenthal Center and the U.S. Special Investigations Office. But the period between 1950 and 1965 essentially represented an effective void in active prosecution. The ex-guards developed characteristic social strategies during this period. They systematically avoided international travel, particularly to countries with significant survivor communities. They maintained deliberately restricted social circles, often limited to people without direct connections to the war period. They developed elaborate alternative explanations for physical scars, particular knowledge of foreign languages, or specific skills acquired during service in the camps. Later family documentation reveals cases where they maintained completely separate identities, even with spouses and children, creating extraordinary psychological compartmentalization. The psychological impact of this double life has been the subject of specific studies by trauma specialists. Clinical testimonies document a high incidence of alcoholism, chronic depression, anxiety disorders, and erratic behaviors among ex-guards identified decades later. These patterns suggest that, contrary to the self-exculpatory narrative developed, many experienced significant effects of perpetrator trauma and subconscious guilt, manifested through specific symptoms even when they maintained explicit denial of moral responsibility. By the late 1970s, most ex-guards had built entirely new lives. Some even reached respectable positions in their communities, actively participating in civic or religious associations without anyone suspecting their past. The functional psychological compartmentalization allowed them to participate seemingly normally in social activities while effectively suppressing memories of incriminating periods. Although later testimonies from family members frequently revealed disturbed nighttime behaviors, suggesting incomplete traumatic processing. This 3-decade period represents the peak of systematic impunity, where individual silence found support in the deliberately cultivated collective amnesia, creating a space for reintegration without effective accountability. However, by the late 1970s, new generations would begin to question this conspiracy of silence, laying the groundwork for a final phase of delayed justice that would partially reconfigure the historical narrative about female participation in the crimes of the Third Reich. The Revenge of Time, late trials against the guards of the Third Reich. From the 1970s, a confluence of cultural, political, and generational factors began to erode the mantle of silence that had effectively protected former SS guards for decades. The paradigm of systematic impunity established in the immediate post-war years faced unprecedented challenges as new investigations, late testimonies, and a renewed public awareness of the Holocaust forced the reopening of seemingly closed or deliberately ignored cases. Organizations specifically dedicated to the pursuit of Nazi criminals, such as the Simon Wiesenthal Center, formally established in 1977, intensified investigative efforts through innovative methodologies. Instead of relying exclusively on frequently incomplete or deliberately destroyed official documentation, they implemented alternative strategies, networks of informants in specific German communities, systematic tracking of family connections through civil records, methodical scrutiny of photographic archives compared to current visual documentation, and forensic linguistic analysis of specific regional accents. These techniques gradually enabled the identification of guards who had remained completely anonymous for decades. The emblematic case of this period was the reopening of the trial against Hildegard Lechert, the notorious Tigress of Majdanek. After serving a reduced sentence for her initial conviction, Lechert had been quietly released in 1956, settling in West Germany under a deliberately minimized profile. New investigations initiated by the Düsseldorf prosecutor's office in 1975, based on recently discovered testimonies and additional documentation provided by Polish authorities, once again placed Lechert before justice in what would become one of the longest trials in modern German judicial history. The Düsseldorf trial against Lechert and other Majdanek officials extended from 1975 to 1981, becoming the longest judicial proceeding in the history of the Federal Republic of Germany up to that point. More than 350 witnesses, including survivors located in Israel, the United States, Australia, and various European countries, testified about specific atrocities at Majdanek, directly identifying Lechert in particular acts of extreme cruelty. The revelation that shocked public opinion during the proceedings was documented evidence that Lechert had been recruited as an informant for the CIA and the German intelligence service BND in the preceding decades, receiving tacit institutional protection in exchange for information on Eastern Europe. This instrumentalization of a war criminal for geopolitical purposes generated significant public outrage and uncomfortable questions about the depth of governmental complicity in the mass evasion of justice by Nazi perpetrators. After extensive deliberation, the Düsseldorf court finally sentenced Leckert to 12 years in prison in 1981, although surprisingly, later documentation would reveal that she also did not serve this sentence in full due to health considerations and the application of sentence reduction regulations. This apparent contradiction between severe judicial rhetoric and softened practical enforcement characterized numerous late cases, where the advanced age of the accused and procedural complexities frequently resulted in only partial implementation of formally pronounced sentences. Parallel to these specific legal developments, a fundamental generational transformation was reshaping German society. Those born after the war, without direct guilt but as heirs to a traumatic national past, began systematically questioning the widespread silence of their parents and grandparents about the Nazi era. This phenomenon, referred to by historians as the breaking of the generational silence pact, was concretely manifested through impactful cultural productions that forced public confrontation with a deliberately suppressed past. Claude Lanzmann's documentary Shoah, released in 1985 after 9 years of production, with an extraordinary runtime of 9 hours and explicit testimonies about the internal functioning of extermination camps, provided an unignorable visual representation of the systematic mechanisms of genocide, including the previously minimized female participation in dominant narratives. Simultaneously, the television broadcast of the miniseries Holocaust by German networks in 1979 reached an estimated audience of 20 million viewers, approximately 50% of the adult West German population, definitively breaking the taboo on public debate about the genocide and generating a collective awareness demanding greater historical accountability. This new cultural atmosphere coincided with fundamental legal advances that allowed for the overcoming of procedural obstacles that had protected war criminals. The doctrine of the imprescriptibility of crimes against humanity, formally adopted by the Federal Republic of Germany in 1979, eliminated technical legal barriers that had shielded perpetrators not prosecuted immediately after the war. Additionally, developments in international jurisprudence expanded the concept of individual responsibility, gradually invalidating the defense of superior orders that so many female guards had successfully used in previous decades. The opening of Soviet archives following the relative easing of Cold War tensions provided extraordinarily valuable additional documentation to researchers. Exhaustive administrative records meticulously maintained by camp administrators, previously inaccessible to Western researchers, revealed full names, specific assignments, and performance evaluations of female guards who had previously evaded detection. These documents often demonstrated direct involvement in selections and executions of women who for decades had presented carefully sanitized versions of their supposedly peripheral administrative roles. The case of Hermine Braunsteiner-Ryan perfectly exemplifies this belated but relentless justice. After serving as a supervisor at Ravensbrück and Majdanek, where she was documented to have participated in mass executions and selections, Braunsteiner emigrated to Canada and later to the United States, obtaining American citizenship through marriage to a U.S. citizen. She lived as a respectable housewife in Queens, New York, until she was casually identified by a survivor in 1964 during a journalistic investigation initiated by the New York Times. Her extradition to Germany in 1973 set a significant international precedent on the priority of prosecuting war crimes over acquired citizenship status, resulting in a life sentence following a 7-year trial that documented her direct involvement in at least 181 specific murders. The trials restarted during this period faced significant challenges inherent to the temporal distance from the events being judged. The passage of time inevitably complicated the collection of physical evidence, while key witnesses had died or faced cognitive decline related to old age and the after effects of prolonged trauma. However, these obstacles were partially offset by significantly improved investigative methodologies, greater international cooperation among judicial agencies, and increasing availability of previously inaccessible documentation. The pursuit of justice transcended national borders through unprecedented international judicial cooperation. In 1987, France prosecuted Ilse Steinbusch, who had served as a guard at Neuengamme before quietly settling in Alsace under an altered identity. Her identification resulted from transnational collaboration between French, German, and Israeli survivor organizations, demonstrating the persistence of networks dedicated to locating perpetrators regardless of the time elapsed or geographical distances. The case established important precedents regarding universal jurisdiction for crimes against humanity, a principle later formally codified in specific national legislations. These late trials revealed distinctive psychological patterns among the accused that differed markedly from behaviors observed during immediate post-war proceedings. Unlike the ideological arrogance and doctrinaire defense exhibited by figures such as Irma Grese in 1945, women prosecuted decades later frequently displayed genuine confusion in the face of accusations concerning people they no longer psychologically identified as themselves. They had built entirely new identities, compartmentalizing or suppressing incriminating memories to the point of notable psychological dissociation. Some, like Anna Hanel, prosecuted in 1983 for documented atrocities in Majdanek, suffered clinically significant nervous breakdowns when confronted with photographs of their SS-uniformed youth and administrative documents personally signed. Forensic psychiatric experts documented dissociative phenomena in which the accused demonstrated a genuine inability to recognize historical actions as their own, having developed elaborate psychological mechanisms to completely separate the former identity from the later constructed persona. Extensive media coverage of these late trials sparked profound public debates on fundamental concepts of justice, collective memory, and historical responsibility. For many young Germans, these proceedings represented an opportunity to finally confront a national past that had remained incompletely processed through decades of silence. German universities began offering specific courses on female participation in Nazism, while archival initiatives systematically collected survivor testimonies specifically focused on female guards, creating a substantial documentary corpus that had previously not existed. For aging Holocaust survivors, many in their 80s during these reopened proceedings, the trials perhaps represented the last chance to witness some form of accountability before their own passing. Documented testimonies reveal extraordinary determination to testify despite advanced physical frailty, as expressed by Eva Kuczynski, 86 years old, during the Frankfurt trial in 1984. "I have waited 40 years for this moment. Physically, I can barely stand, but I need her to hear my voice describing what she did, not for revenge, but for historical truth." The impact of these trials significantly transcended the individual specific cases. The prosecution of Martha Linke in Munich in 1982 inspired academic investigations specifically focused on female participation in the Nazi repressive apparatus, fundamentally challenging established assumptions about the nature of evil and gender roles during the Third Reich. A radical re-evaluation gradually emerged of women's roles not as passive bystanders or circumstantial victims, but as active perpetrators fully capable of systematized cruelty comparable to their male counterparts. By the late 1980s, institutional enthusiasm for prosecuting aging cases inevitably began to wane. Practical obstacles increased exponentially with each passing year. Witnesses continually passed away, additional documentary evidence rarely surfaced, and humanitarian concerns about prosecuting frequently ill octogenarian defendants raised ethical questions within the judicial system. The imminent collapse of the Soviet bloc in 1989 diverted public attention toward new immediate historical challenges, while German reunification in 1990 introduced urgent socio-legal priorities that appeared incongruent with the continued allocation of scarce resources toward aging war criminals. Despite these inevitable factors, the late trials against female guards of the Third Reich represented a crucial moment in the evolution of contemporary transitional justice. They established the fundamental principle that the passage of time does not absolve responsibility for systematic atrocities, creating precedents later applied in diverse contexts such as Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and Cambodia. The enduring lesson was that justice, though imperfect and delayed, retains fundamental symbolic and practical value in societies seeking to reconcile with traumatic legacies while establishing standards for future behavior. The final chapter of this history continues to be written today. Even now, researchers at the Simon Wiesenthal Center and similar organizations persist in identifying surviving perpetrators, though their numbers decline inexorably with the natural passage of time. The meticulous documentation of these historical cases transcends the likelihood of further significant trials, serving as a permanent reminder of the consequences when moral indifference becomes institutionalized, and human cruelty finds expression through bureaucratic structures that normalize collectively destructive behavior under a veneer of legitimacy. The final legacy of these women remains fundamentally ambiguous. For Holocaust survivors and their descendants, they represent the physical embodiment of the systematized evil that destroyed entire families and millennia-old communities. For historians, they constitute a crucial case study of humanity's capacity to normalize aberrant behavior through institutional context and social conformity pressures. For legal scholars, their cases established key precedents that shaped modern international humanitarian law. And for broader society, they remain a disturbing reminder of the fragility of moral inhibitions when social structures promote the systematic dehumanization of others. Perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all is the recognition that the perpetrators were not mythological monsters, but ordinary women transformed by ideological indoctrination, economic incentives, and social pressure. Fully understanding how social mechanisms turned domestic aides, nurses, and clerical workers into direct enforcers of genocidal policies remains an enduring moral and intellectual challenge, particularly relevant in contemporary societies confronting a resurgence of authoritarian movements, once again promoting rhetoric of exclusion and dehumanization. The approximately 3,500 women who served as guards in Nazi concentration camps therefore represent more than just a closed historical chapter. Their collective trajectory, from recruitment and participation in the extermination system to strategies of evading justice, silent reintegration into civil society, and eventual late confrontation with historical responsibility, provides a fundamental case study on individual responsibility in contexts of systematic state criminality. The lessons derived from their histories remain unfortunately relevant in a world where human rights violations continue to manifest through the everyday participation and collaboration of seemingly ordinary citizens.